Hello everyone, it's Pokey Phenomenal, and today we have a little something special for you. So, you might have noticed that we like Fire Red and Leaf Green, and, some of you might be thinking, in this Pokemon climate, why would we be posting so many Fire Red and Leaf Green videos?
Right, in an age where a new Pokemon game comes out once every year or more, we're still here, posting Fire Red and Leaf Green.
So, the reason we're doing this video is because Andrew and I want to discuss, why specifically we both love Fire Red and Leaf Green, and why we love it, not only as a game to Nuzlocke, but as a Pokemon game in general. Because I feel like Fire Red and Leaf Green are older games at this point, but I think people in a general sense like these games, but I don't think a lot of people love them, and I don't think a lot of people would say that they're their favorite games. We're here to make the case for Fire and Leaf Green and why we love these games.
So yeah, this video will be really laid back and casual, and really this is not a video that anybody asked for, but it's a video that Mike and I felt like we needed to make just because we love Fire Red and Leaf Green so much and are going to play it so much. It's kind of like we like this game so much that we kind of just want to talk about it and talk about why. And also almost, I guess, give an excuse for why, with so many Pokemon games out there and so many games that have such varied content, why are we coming back to one of the objectively more simple games? So we're just going to kind of take it casually and walk through some of our thoughts on the game, things that we enjoy with it, why we continue to play it, and hopefully we can confer to you some of that love, I guess, is what we're trying to do. So yeah, we wanted to start, the first thing we would talk about, I guess, is our history with the game. So would you like to start, Mike?
Sure. So, Fire and Leaf Green was the first Pokemon game that I actually owned. I owned Leaf Green, the objectively better version. Growing up, I loved Pokemon. I liked watching the show, but I didn't really play the games. I had played, Red and Blue with some friends at school, but I never owned a Pokemon game up until Fire and Leaf Green. So when I got Leaf Green, it was my first introduction to the actual, mainline Pokemon games, and I didn't really, know it at the time about, the idea that it was a remake of Gen 1. I knew that it was based on the Kanto region, but I guess, when a 9-year-old me didn't really realize what it was at that point. It just was like, oh, I know all these guys.
Hey, I've seen that guy before.
So yeah, Leaf Green was my first actual Pokemon experience, and I just loved the game. I loved, the Pokemon, I loved the region. Fire and Leaf Green really just solidified my love for the Pokemon series.
So for me, Leaf Green wasn't actually my first Pokemon game. Because I did play Yellow as a kid. I got a copy of Yellow from my cousin and played through that game so much. And it is the reason for a lot of the things that I ended up attaching to in Pokemon that I still love today, like Fat Pikachu, Caterpie, just different things like that I attached to at that time when I played through Yellow. But after Yellow, I didn't actually continue with Pokemon for a little while. I think there were a few years where I didn't have the games, and so I wasn't playing Pokemon all the time. When that was broken was, I think, in elementary school when Ruby and Sapphire first came out. Everybody was going crazy. The Pokemon craze had been continuing to that point for a long time, specifically with Pokemon cards. They were just, absolutely everywhere. And so everyone had, the fever for Ruby and Sapphire when those games came out. And I did play those a little bit, on the playground with my friends. But I never owned them. After Yellow, the next Pokemon game that I owned was my copy of Leaf Green. I actually got my copy of Leaf Green, and I got the strategy guide for Fire Red and Leaf Green from my aunt. Right, of course. The wonderful strategy. It was so good, by the way. That strategy guide was so incredible. I don't know if I can put a picture of the actual one that I had. I don't remember which one I had. I don't know if it was an official one or if it was a Prima. I'm not sure. Either way, my aunt got me a copy of Leaf Green. And I had the strategy guide, and that was, I think, when I got really hooked. I played Yellow and attached a lot of identity to Pokemon, but I didn't get hooked until Leaf Green. And I played so much Leaf Green. I memorized the strategy guide backwards and forwards to the point that I became a bit of a guru on the playground. Children would come to me and be like, Andrew, what level does Seal evolve into Dugong? And I would know because I memorized the book. So like, I attached to Leaf Green very heavily and I just played it a lot. And for me, having come from Yellow, I think I was really, really well able to appreciate the upgrade, the differences from Kanto that I knew. Just like having the Sevi Islands blew my mind. Like it
Right.
absolutely blew me away, having that as just like this extra region. Yeah, I mean, I played through Leaf Green a lot. I think it was my most played Pokemon game until Pokemon X when I started shiny hunting. So like I played Pokemon Leaf Green all the time, and it is still my favorite game.
Yeah, I mean, for me, as I was playing Leaf Green, people were playing Ruby and Sapphire, and playing Leaf Green got me into those games. It was pretty chill. Like, I didn't have like a ton of friends like were like playing Pokemon, so like Leaf Green was kind of like my own experience initially. But it's what it got me into Ruby and Sapphire, and then I got Emerald after, and I enjoyed that game a lot too. But yeah, I mean, for me at Leaf Green, it helped forge like the Pokemon bond I had with my friend Gage, who I actually like because I owned Leaf Green and then I got Fire Red because I loved Leaf Green so much. And I actually let Gage have my copy of Fire Red so like he could play it so that we could play together. And that's how we kind of like bonded over Pokemon, and then we became more engrossed with Pokemon in like in Gen 4, like the Diamond and Pearl. That's like when we were really hooked on it, but like Fire and Leaf Green is like what sort of sparked that interest, that love for Pokemon.
That's beautiful. So obviously we both loved Fire Red and Leaf Green kind of originally, and then this was before Mike and I ever knew each other, and we became friends as adults. And I don't know, we eventually, like, we talked about Pokemon. I don't know when it was that we talked about how much we loved Fire Red and Leaf Green, but at a certain point, we ended up mutilating our experience in a good way. But we ended up irreparably altering our interaction with Fire Red and Leaf Green by playing it as a Nuzlocke. And this actually wasn't specifically our idea. I think that we had all thought about playing Nuzlockes before, but it was actually Eric, who we make content with at Half Phenomenal, who brought up the idea to our group. Like, he was the first one to say, how about we actually do the Nuzlocke? And I think for all of us, it was very natural. Like, it was a very natural decision to play Fire Red and Leaf Green first. Given how simple the games are, they are like the first region. They don't have so many bells and whistles compared to some of the other games. They're a little shorter. And then I think just the cherry on top was how much the two of us specifically loved those games. But we decided to play Fire Red and Leaf Green as a Nuzlocke, and that sent us on a twisting and spiraling journey that has led us here today, playing challenge runs and making stuff on YouTube. Like, none of this would have happened had we not played that initial Nuzlocke of Fire Red and Leaf Green.
I don't remember if we really ever talked about how much we enjoyed Fire and Leaf Green prior to the Nuzlockes, because we became, like you said, we became friends when we were adults, and we were both mutually friends with Gage, who I mentioned earlier, who was my friend that I had played Fire and Leaf Green with. So like he and I had a bond with it, but you and I may have just like casually just mentioned like, yeah, like we like Pokemon, like we like Fire and Leaf Green, but we never really delved into how much we actually really enjoyed the games. And the Nuzlocke idea was a group idea because I think for us and for a lot of Pokemon fans, we've been playing these games, especially, for older Pokemon fans, we've been playing these games since we were children, and they've largely been the same game with a few gimmicks and bells and whistles here and there. So the casual Pokemon experience gets kind of stale for, people like us who have played dozens of these games at this point. And so the idea of playing a Nuzlocke was an enticing idea for even just our friend group, just because we all had kind of fallen out of love with Pokemon. It's like it was a new way to get a fresh experience on this franchise that we love. And so we decided, to start with Fire and Leaf Green just because of how relatively easy it would be. And our goal was to start with this in Gen 3 and like progress through the game. So like we would play, the games in sequential order. And we just had a really good time. We did it in like a day or two. We did it like over a weekend.
Yeah, I think it was like 2 days that we just blasted through the entire Nuzlocke.
And, we made some good memories. Eric did not have a great time in this run.
Eric did not have a great time, but we did, and I beat it. It was actually So I don't think we'll get too deep into the particulars of that Nuzlocke, but suffice it to say, like, playing through that, I think opened our eyes to this entire, I mean, there's an entire world. I think it's similar to how so many people end up getting into Nuzlocks. When you play your first Nuzlocke, you realize there is so much more that these games have to offer that has just kind of been sitting there waiting for you. You've spent all this time playing the games normally, that the moment that you realize what they can actually be, like the challenge they can offer, the storylines that they can create. Once you realize that, it's really easy to get hooked. And, you know, we've played a lot of Nuzlocks since then. I wouldn't say we're the craziest, but we've gotten kind of crazy with some of the challenges that we've done. Mike and I have, on our own, completed all of the monotype runs in Fire Red and Leaf Green. And you haven't seen all of them, but we will now be making videos on those as well, because I think it's an interesting thing to show people. But, I mean, at the end of the day, we played that first Nuzlocke, and it kind of sent us on this journey of experiencing Nuzlocks in all of these different Pokemon games and realizing how much that challenge can offer to deepen your connection to the game and intensify your enjoyment of it. And I think for a lot of people like who get into that, maybe they play some of these older games. I think Fire Red and Leaf Green is a pretty popular starter Nuzlocke. But to me, I think that's it, right? Like, it's a starter Nuzlocke, and a lot of times people move on to Platinum, Heart Gold and Soul Silver, Black and White 2. Like, when people start to get a taste and a feel for Nuzlocks and how they work, Fire Red and Leaf Green kind of always feels like a launch point. You're jumping off from them and you're moving on to something else. Whereas while we did that too, I think something has kept us coming back, and something has made it just so accessible to us to continue to create new storylines and get different types of enjoyment out of these games. I think that's really what we want to talk about today. Just what it is within Fire Red and Leaf Green for us that makes it so good as a starter Nuzlocke, but good as a Nuzlocke that you can continue to play and continue to find enjoyment with, if you're us. Maybe this doesn't apply to everybody. We want to talk about it so that you can kind of understand where we're coming from with why we play this game so often. So before we talk about this game in terms of a Nuzlocke and why we think it's so good for that, I do want to, I guess, put a disclaimer or make clear that usually when we play this game, we're doing so on a computer. And when we do that, we're able to do certain things like speed up the gameplay, incorporate rare candies if we need to. Like, we played this game enough that we feel comfortable altering our experience of it a bit, and that does come into play with our thoughts of like how quickly you can do it and how easy it is to do certain things. Usually we are playing with at least a bit of an altered state in the game. I do just want to make that clear before we start talking about it, that is something that we view as, at this point, almost integral to the experience of repeated Nuzlocks in this game.
And I also want to make a disclaimer that when we talk about these games in comparison to modern Pokemon games, for us, our definition of modern Pokemon might be different than yours, because for a lot of us, you know, we started falling out of love with Pokemon around Gen 7, and, you know, none of us have really played Gen 8 in any real capacity, so, you know, when we're talking about these games in relation to modern Pokemon games, we're specifically talking about, you know, Pokemon games post Gen 3, specifically like Gen 4, 5, and 6. Alright, so now I think we're going to talk about why specifically we just think that Fire and Leaf Green are good games to Nuzlocke. And I think the first reason is just the fact that these games are relatively easy and simple compared to, you know, the games that have come after it. You know, Pokemon games are obviously pretty easy overall. I mean, they're obviously targeted at children, so they're not too complicated games to pick up and play. So, you know, most Pokemon games don't have a very crazy, you know, difficulty curve. But I think compared to, you know, some of the modern games, maybe more specific, like the Gen 4 and 5 games, like Fire and Leaf Green is a relatively easy game. And I think more importantly is the simplicity aspect of it, the fact that obviously this is a remake of the Gen 1 games, but they were pretty faithful remakes in that they didn't really add a lot to these games in terms of like the main quest. But it is nice, especially after playing the, you know, the more modern games and coming back to a game like Fire and Leaf Green, like you realize just like how much more involved the modern games are in terms of like cutscenes and the tutorial, and, you know, the game kind of hand-holding you and forcing you, you know, down the main path of the gym battles and then the Elite Four and champion fights. Whereas, you know, Fire and Leaf Green, there's just, you start off in Pallet Town, you deliver Oak's parcel, You see the old man catch the Weedle, and that's kind of it. You're just kind of off on your own to just go through the game at your own pace. Because there isn't that. There is a narrative, but it's not as, complex as, Gen 4 and onwards. The simplicity is also helpful in terms of just, the relative length of the game. When we played our Nuzlocke, we did it over a weekend. These aren't very long games, so they're not as much of a time commitment compared to some of the other Pokemon games, which is nice. In terms of just the difficulty as well, there isn't, in some of the later games, there are trainers or encounters that are very difficult in a Nuzlocke perspective. People know these as potential run enders, or they warn of these aspects of the gameplay. Whereas Fire and Leaf Green doesn't really have that. There are some tough battles, but I don't think there's really anything that's so crazy powerful that short of just really bad RNG in some cases, you're probably not gonna wipe in these games. So it is just a good, not only a first Nuzlocke experience, but just a good Nuzlocke experience. If you want to play Nuzlocke and actually see it through, I think these are some of the best games you can play because you're very likely to complete it.
And if I could get a little bit more granular with it, I think there are a few things that Fire Red and Leaf Green has when compared to the other games, just at the technical level. When you're playing through the game, there are certain options that you are given within the game that just kind of might seem simple at first. They might seem like they're not that important, but as you play the game more and more and you play other games, you start to realize how much freedom it gives you and how much variety it gives you to play multiple runs of the game, not just one. So for example, I think that the lack of held items, the amount of held items that this game gives you is actually really good, because you play a modern game like a Platinum or an X and Y, and you get a lot of held items. You get plates that can help you boost different types of moves. You get leftovers, you get shell bells, you get a black belt. You get a lot of things, a lot of held items that are very, very useful to multiple Pokemon on your team, and that you can kind of, before you go into a major fight, you organize all the items on your team. You have a lot of boosted attacks, and you just have an incredible amount of variety with those items, which can be a really good thing. It feels nice to have that in the more modern games of, I know that I can boost my Pokemon, make them stronger, give myself a little bit of insurance. But at the same time, Fire Red and Leaf Green, you don't have to worry about that so much. You're given the Quick Claw, the Black Glasses, and that's you don't get a lot outside of those simple, kind of relatively innocuous held items that are given to you by the game. But they help. They're something that you can use. But a lot of times you're going to be using berries, or you're going to have something else that you can use to make them, to give them a little boost, but you're not putting a lot of mental bandwidth on it. And it's also not improving your game too much, which for a simple game like this, an easy game like this, that's really good. But, and to move on to my second point, you are also able to purchase items. And this game gives you a lot of great purchase items, not just in terms of items, but TMs and various things like that. The amount of freedom that you have in purchasing in Fire Red and Leaf Green is so nice. It is so incredibly welcome compared to some of the other games. Because by the time you get to Celadon, you can buy Dig, you can buy Brick Break, you can buy Attract, right? You can buy all of these super useful TMs, and the only thing that's prohibiting you from just continuing to buy them is money. So you get these great TMs that are very readily available to you, but they also cost a resource that you have to monitor. So you do get a little bit of interplay between what you need and what you want to get. You have good options, but you need to think, what do I really need for this playthrough? What am I going to buy in this playthrough with the money that I have and the resources that I have? And that extends to the elemental stones. You have easy access to the elemental stones, so you can evolve any Pokemon that you need to with that, which is not true in all of the games. And even up to super good moves like Flamethrower, Ice Beam, Thunderbolt, Shadow Ball, you are given those. You're given the option to get those in the game corner. When you get to Celadon, you can get the coin case, and you can use your money to buy coins and get those moves. And of course, this game has expendable TMs. So when you use it, it's gone, and you have to expend that resource again if you'd like to get it again. So I think for some people, maybe this is a negative, but for me, it adds up to a really good interactive experience where every run, you can take these purchasable items and you can take these limitations and work with them to make each run a little bit more unique and give each run kind of it is what you make of it. Like, what can I do to make this run specifically as successful as possible? It's not a very hard game, but it does have this interplay where you have a lot of good options. But that's the thing, they're options and you have to choose between some of those options. I think that interplay is a little bit more interesting than maybe some people think. And it really makes the game more fun for me to be able to say, like, I have enough money to buy 1 TM. Do I want Flamethrower or do I want Thunderbolt? It's good to have to make those choices sometimes, I think. And then the third thing that I think, just in a more particular way on how this game is set up that's really nice, is that Kanto is a bit of an open region. By the time you hit the middle game, you open up. Like, you get to Celadon once again. You can kind of choose where you go. Like, are you going to beat Erica now, or are you going to... I mean, of course, with a Nuzlocke, if you have level caps, this does kind of impact it a little bit. Yeah, you'll probably fight Erica, but even from there, do I want to go fight Koga? Or do I want to go down to Saffron and deal with what I need to deal with there, fight Sabrina first? The game opens up, and so your encounters open up, your trainer battles open up, your gym battles open up. The flow of the story opens up so much that every time, again, based on what you have, you can make a decision, and you can make that run unique, and you can decide what's the best way that I'm going to do this. But at the same time, if you get used to it and you play through it multiple times, you can also start to think, this is how I like to play through this. I like to go to Koga first and then go over to Sabrina. It's easier for me. I know the steps that I want to take. It just makes the game a little more comfortable, but it also makes it a little more permeable. Like, you can change it and you can work with it to make the run what you need it to be. I think the big thing that Fire Red and Leaf Green have is that they have this simplicity and they have this wealth of options, but it's a wealth of options in a different way. It's not a wealth of options in the way of in X and Y, where you're just given so many items that you can immediately use. It's that you have a set amount of items, but you have a wealth of ways to use those and a wealth of ways to engage with those options that the game gives you. And I think that that's really interesting. I think that it makes the act of playing the game multiple times a little more fresh and kind of keeps me coming back, and it allows me to kind of set different strategies when I'm playing through the game.
And another reason that Fire and Leaf Green are really good games to Nuzlocke are the encounters that you can get in these games. Specifically the variety of encounters and kind of like the balance of the Pokemon compared to the challenge of the game. I think that Fire and Leaf Green has a good variety of encounters. I know a lot of the modern games also do well in this aspect. Like, a lot of the modern games have a pretty good variety of encounters, especially, I think games like Black and White 2 and X and Y, even in like the early routes, like there's a pretty decent variety of Pokemon you can get, and I think Fire and Leaf Green is similar to that. Kanto has the problem of there's a good chance of you getting a Rattata or a Pidgey on a lot of the routes, but
it's functionally guaranteed even.
Yeah, but there is, there are a few, unique and helpful encounters on even some of the early routes that make the game enjoyable when you get a pretty decent encounter at different stages of the game. Like on Route 22 you can get a Mankey, in Viridian Forest you can get a Pikachu, even in Mount Moon, Zubats are abound, but you can get a Paris. So there's a decent amount of Pokemon on the routes, and there's a good chance that you're likely to have some unique encounter if if you play the game multiple times, if you're doing multiple Nuzlockes. There's a good chance you might have a decently various team depending on your encounter luck.
And I think one thing about Fire Red and Leaf Green is that, of course, it can be said that compared to the later games, there's not the same breadth of encounters, because there's not as many Pokemon. You have a smaller amount of Pokemon, and you necessarily then have a smaller amount of encounters available to you across the game. But I think the important thing about Fire Red and Leaf Green is that in the context of the game itself, when you're comparing to what everybody around you has and the order of the encounters, what encounters you can get and when, the variety is, I think, high enough to give you some interesting aspects to any individual run. For example, you're not always going to get the Mankey, you're not always going to get a Poliwhirl. Even in Mount Moon, somewhere where it's oh, do I get the Geodude or the Zubat? That in its own way is a nice slice of variety, because your next chance at that is after the next two gyms. You have to wait until you've beaten Misty and Surge, and then you'll get a chance again for maybe an encounter similar to that in Rock Tunnel. So the game is offering you some interesting encounters, you're not entirely sure which one you're going to get. Like, and that's always the case in a Nuzlocke, but here where there is a smaller amount, having a slightly smaller pool makes it even more interesting to a run when you get something that you haven't had before, like when you get a Clefairy in Mount Moon. When you go into Rock Tunnel and you get the Machop, like that's your encounter, and it's something that you then have to learn how to work with. Like, every Nuzlocke and every game is going to have that experience, but Fire Red and Leaf Green, because the amount of variety in the other trainers that you're fighting is really not as high. Like, the trainers that you're fighting don't have incredibly well-balanced teams. In another Nuzlocke, yeah, I got a Machop, but I'm going to be fighting a lot of people who have Psychic Pokemon. Whereas in Fire Red and Leaf Green, like, you have the Machop, and you're not going to see Psychic types until you get to Koga's Gym. And you can use that Machop in so many varieties of contexts that you wouldn't be able to use it in a different game. So it is contextually, I think, the variety is a lot higher than maybe some people would give it credit for. And I think that the balance of variety is pretty good. I think you mentioned that, like, at the beginning, there are some bread and butter encounters that you're going to get that there's a pretty good chance you're going to get a bug. Although you might get the Pikachu, but there's a pretty good chance you're going to get a bug at the beginning. Pretty much guaranteed a Pidgey and a Rattata. And there are these encounters that you can count on and know that you're going to use. Whereas some of the future games don't always have that to the same extent. They have enough variety that you're almost losing out on some of the bread and butter encounters of, like, I know I'm going to get this, and now I just need to learn how to supplement it, which is what you're doing in Fire Red and Leaf Green. I think that act of supplementation of a team of kind of core Pokemon is a pretty interesting thing that you don't always get. Like, you're not always even given that option. So that's, I think, another layer to Fire Red and Leaf Green that is interesting.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said about the fact that the game is pretty good about giving you useful encounters, especially, en routes before, an upcoming gym battle. You mentioned, that like, compared to some of the later games, Fire and Leaf Green has a pretty limited dex, so there is variety in the encounters. There isn't as much variety because there isn't as much Pokemon as some of the later games, but the game is still pretty good about giving you options for some of the specific battles you have to do. Like, you can go up the Nugget Bridge and likely to get a grass type, like a Bellsprout or an Oddish for Misty. You have the guaranteed Diglett for Surge.
Unless you're Eric. Rest in peace, Eric.
Poor guy didn't stand a chance. Arena Trap Dugtrio.
Arena Trap Dugtrio comes for us all eventually.
Even Blaine, the full specializes in fire types, yet you have to surf to get to him. The game is pretty good about, giving you useful encounters. And one of the nice things about, to me, there's a beauty in simplicity. And I think, there is a good thing to be said about, like, the modern games, like the fact that there are a lot of Pokemon and there's a lot of variety on the routes that, for a Nuzlocke, like, it is fun to see what you're going to get on any given route, because there might be like 5, 6, 7 different encounters you might be able to get. So, like, the modern games have a strength in that variety, whereas I think Fire and Leaf Green has a decent amount of variety, but I think it's almost like gambling, or like there's almost like a high, hitting a high or a low, like depending on the encounter you get, because there are, much more common sort of baseline encounters, pretty unique encounters intermittently, like, mixed in. Or, like, if you're going to fight Brock and you have a Charmander, you probably don't want to get, like, the Rattata, but, like, if you get that Mankey, that feels all the more, that feels great, that feels all the better. I think having the chance of getting a decent amount of good encounters, I think there's something to be said to, like, having that feeling of, like, getting the unique Pokemon feels all the better when you miss out on, like, getting the more common ones. I think that's, a strength of Fire and Leaf Green, is that you do feel the hype when you get a decently rare encounter. An encounter nonetheless that is an option, but, like, it might have a lower percent chance than getting a more common encounter, but when you do get that rare or unique or even just, like, flat out helpful encounter, it feels all the better in this type of game.
And I think one last thing to say about encounters in this game is that in every Pokemon game, and like in every Nuzlocke, I think that there are there are some Pokemon that are better than others, right? And there are some encounters that, while they don't necessarily break the game, they trivialize portions of it. And we've seen what happens when you get, you can nearly guarantee, and in some cases guarantee, a Gibble depending on your rule set in Pokemon Platinum, and Garchomp then trivializes large portions of that game, including a lot of the Elite Four, because it's just so good. And, like, a lot of Pokemon games have things like that, and Leaf Leaf Green, Fire Red are not an exception. But one interesting thing is that, and this is a bit subjective in what Pokemon fall under that category, but for me, a lot of the Pokemon that fall under the category of being really, really good to the point of potentially breaking parts of your game or trivializing parts of it are Pokemon that are held behind a special condition, right? It's a Pokemon, it's a gift Pokemon, it's a trade Pokemon. And because of that, Fire Red and Leaf Green have this interesting ability to, you can easily limit those encounters. Rather than saying like, well, Garchomp's really good, so I'm just going to ban Garchomp, you can just say, well, I'm going to ban gift Pokemon, I'm going to ban trade Pokemon. Because in Fire Red and Leaf Green, if you ban gift Pokemon, Lapras, all the Evolutions, Snorlax, are all immediately taken out, which are all great Pokemon, but sometimes it's nice to struggle, like to have to do the challenge without them. And then if you further go against trade Pokemon, that gets rid of Jinx, who is, I think, one of the best Pokemon in this game, which leaves, like, beyond that, you have, like, Ghastly. I think Ghastly is the big one that we can all agree is, like, a huge encounter because it's pretty much guaranteed that you get it. This is another interesting point of, like, if you have the ability to evolve it to a Gengar, he can make a lot of portions of the game really, really easy. But, like, I think one isn't bad, you know? Like, if you want to go in here Leaf Green and Fire Red because of the limitations of how many Pokemon there are and how many of those really strong Pokemon, like they actively, like they wanted to give you these easy, good Pokemon. They wanted to give them to you easily, and that retroactively ended up making it really easy to limit them in a challenge run. So I think while Fire Red and Leaf Green might have a few encounters that are kind of busted, most of them you can limit, and the ones that you can't, such as Gengar or Alakazam, they have something else. Like, are you going to allow yourself to trade them? Are you able to trade them and get that? And like Kadabra itself, I mean, catching an Abra is always a toss-up. You almost get the situation of you earned it. If you get the Abra, you earned it. You got it, and like that's your strong Pokemon, but for that run you got lucky, and in the next one maybe you won't. So I think like this game, of course, with a lot of concessions, a lot of changed rules, which is what you have to do to get to this point, but this game does give you a pretty easy avenue to avoid these busted encounters that are just going to trivialize your game. A lot of times you can make the experience it's never going to be incredibly hard by nature of the games, but you can avoid it being brain dead, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
And one final point we want to hit on is, aside from the general Nuzlocke, we also think that Fire and Leaf Green are great games for challenge runs, and this has to do with a lot of the points we already discussed. But in terms of a monotype run, the fact that Fire and Leaf Green has a good Pokedex, but it does have a limited Pokedex compared to the modern games. I think it creates a good environment for a challenge run, because for most of the types you have a couple of options, but there's only a few. Sometimes there might be only one, and sometimes they're not all that great, but some of them are really great. So I think there's a decent amount of uniqueness in the monotype runs in these games because of the limited nature of the Pokemon. Depending on the challenge, it can be either a pretty easy challenge if you're doing, say, like a mono flying or a mono water run. There are plenty of encounters in these games with a decent amount of type variety within those types. Just an overall fun challenge run. Whereas if you're doing, like, say, a dragon or a ghost Monron, or God forbid a steel, there's only
now who would be crazy enough to do that?
I don't know, like, give that man a medal. But if you're doing a challenge like that, it's going to be pretty hard. So there is a nice ability to kind of choose your own difficulty with the monotype runs in these games, because there is a decent mix among the types and the representation in these games that you can have a very interesting challenge run depending on what type you pick.
I think even beyond that, like, obviously we're talking a lot about monotype runs because that's the main type of challenge run that we've liked to do, especially with this game. But even when it comes to like other types of challenge runs, like a single Pokemon challenge run, some kind of themed challenge run, just restricting different aspects of the game no matter what it is you're doing. One real strength of Fire Red and Leaf Green in terms of challenge runs that are going even further beyond a normal Nuzlocke is that this game is pretty easy. And the fact that it's pretty easy allows like people like us, or even people who are not as into a challenge run as us, a chance to give it a go. Because if you run into, say, Black and White 2, and you're trying to do a challenge run, I think that sometimes there's a certain level of necessity to being in a real mindset to be doing a challenge. Like, you have to be serious about doing a challenge run because there's going to be a lot of difficulties. Those games are hard. The AI is a little harder. Some of your options are a little bit more, they're different, and you're going to have to go about things differently. So like, while a challenge run can be really fun on those games, you are necessarily going at it, I think, with maybe a different attitude. Fire Red and Leaf Green, like Mike just said, like, there is such a level of choosing your own amount of difficulty that people like us who might want to try to do something like the Dragon or Ghost or Steel monotype run where you have a single Pokemon and that's it, can have a chance to do that. Or people who want to try a little bit of a simpler one, or even people who want to try a hard one but not have want to try a limited one but not have an incredibly difficult time with it. Fire Red and Leaf Green are easy enough and they're forgiving enough to give some people who might normally be a little bit overwhelmed the chance to try a challenge run and have a good time with it. And I think that's great. Like, I think that's really, really good as a game to be that open and that have that much freedom in terms of who can pick up this game and try a new way of playing it. So I think like all of those things in mind, if we just take all of that together in terms of simplicity, in terms of variety, in terms of some of the limitations, and just in terms of ease of play, this is probably, I think this is why Mike and I think Fire Red and Leaf Green are just overall such incredible games to Nuzlocke, such incredible games to play. But we also, I guess, should talk about why it's so easy for us to play it so much. Like, even taking all of that, this is a game that if we wanted to, we could probably play it like once a week, once every other week, and not get tired of it. So why is that?
Well, I think probably the biggest reason, and I think this was definitely put into perspective for us after we started doing Nuzlockes, especially since we started doing them in an order. The fact that Fire and Leaf Green are just very straight to the point. There's not a lot of fluff in these games, and I think that's just not only one of its greatest strengths for like a Nuzlocke, but just in terms of just playing the game itself, because in the modern games there's a lot more to them in terms of just the initial setup of the story, and there might be multiple tutorials, and there's definitely more of a push for a narrative and storytelling. All of these things take away from the gameplay, the core gameplay of just playing a Pokemon game. Whereas Fire and Leaf Green doesn't really have that. Like I said earlier, you have a little bit of a tutorial in the beginning, but after that, the game just opens up and you're free to just go about your gauntlet, taking on the gyms. I think that is a nice... it's almost like a breath of fresh air coming from modern Pokemon to play these games again. The fact that you can just hop in and like beat it in a couple of hours, whereas that might take a couple of hours. You might only be like a couple gyms in, like a modern Pokemon game, with just the amount of extra narrative that's forced down your throat as a player. So it's very liberating to play a game like Fire and Leaf Green, where you kind of just go do what you want to do so early on.
Right. And the game itself, from that point, it starts to open up more. Like, you play it and you do your beginning part of the game and it's pretty quick, and then it opens up, and when it opens up, it's like the rest of the game is just open to you, like Koga, Sabrina, Blaine, Giovanni, and then just going up to the Elite Four. Like, it can happen so quickly if you want it to, that you can just kind of decide how much you want to be within that space. How long do you want to spend on this run? How much do you want to get done? Or when do you want to try to proceed? Like, there's almost all of it is left to you, and being able to do that every time without being held back so much by the game itself, like, allows you to just get in there quickly and start doing what you want to do. And even beyond that, I think in terms of replayability, something that I really wanted to mention is that this game is simple and this game is easy, and it's a classic, like, in terms of it's been around for a long time and it was an early game, all things considered. But at the same time, like, it's modern. Like, they modernized this game to the point that it is easy to replay it. It has an easy to use box. It's easy to use the move deleter. It's easy to use HMs and use things like that. It's easy to manipulate your party, change moves around. At the end of the day, it's the quality of life features are to a high enough standard that I never feel impeded by the features of this game. And even if we come into mechanical features, if we talk about the physical special split, or if we talk about consumable TMs. Those are things that certainly, like, there's a level of personal taste to them. But for me, the core that needs to be there is there. It's a smooth Pokemon experience. It's generally a hassle-free experience. The game is modern enough that it's very, very easy to play through it. And then the game is set up in such a way that it's easy to play it how you want and do what you want without being held back by the game itself. And for me, I think that is probably the number one point that it has in terms of replayability. It's just so easy. I don't get tired of it because there's nothing in the game that's making me tired of playing it. Like, it's easy and I can get in there and I can start doing what I want to do and having a good time.
Okay, so after all that, I think it's fair to say that Andrew and I really love these games. So I think now we want to talk from a bit of a more subjective standpoint of just why we love Fire and Leaf Green so much. And I think one of the reasons is that we both just like the Kanto region. I know there's some mixed feelings in the Pokemon community of Kanto, and obviously just like taking away from the fact that, you know, the region has been remade more than others, and the Pokemon representation, you know, can be a bit strong in some of the modern games. So just talking about the core region itself, the actual Kanto region, I think these games, you know, do a good job of letting you traverse the region, and the region itself is, I think, a good region to play through. It's pretty simple, it's pretty simplistic and linear, but like we've talked about, once you hit that middle point, it opens up, and there's a bit more freedom in how you traverse the region, how you tackle the gyms. I think also just like there isn't a lot of challenge in traversing the region. I know HMs are the cursed features of Pokemon, the cardinal sin of Pokemon, as some might say, but I think the game does a decent job of giving HMs, you know, at appropriate times. And also in terms of just like the RPG aspect of the game, like there aren't a lot of like, you know, dungeons in the game, like Mount Moon and Rock Tunnel, and I guess like to a lesser extent like Viridian Forest and like the Celadon Game Corner, or even Silphco. There aren't like a ton of dungeons in the game, and they aren't overly challenging. I know, you know, Rock Tunnel can be a bit of a pain, especially without Flash, and even like Silphco, like there's, you know, if you're not familiar with where you have to go, like there are a lot of trainers and floors in that dungeon, but I don't think it's too difficult, you know, even compared to some of the modern games. And you know, for a game like Fire and Leaf Green, like because it's so simplistic and so short, like if you do play it a fair amount, like you get familiar, like, you know, these dungeons are not much of a challenge at all.
For example, like Rock Tunnel has just a couple necessary trainers, Viridian Forest has one, Silphco has only Gary and Giovanni, and one Rocket Grunt, I believe, that you have to fight, or two Rocket Grunts you have to fight.
Yeah.
It's just, you know, there are ways when you get used to it to make these dungeons pretty trivial, but like they still hold a lot for you. And in challenge runs, I mean, that's a fun thing in a challenge run in itself, to like feel like you're making progress through a dungeon, but also you can avoid most of the trainers if you want to, but you have trainers to like give you money, give you experience. I think it plays again into those options that we talked about earlier on how much you want to do. The game kind of lets you decide.
Yeah. And I think another aspect that I don't know if a lot of people necessarily consider is in terms of a playthrough. I think these games aren't that difficult to grind in. I think, you know, especially compared to a game like, say, Heart Gold, Soul Silver, which has, you know, a very atrocious grinding process with just the amount of experience you get from Pokemon and the poor leveling. I think in Fire and Leaf Green, like, you get a decent amount of experience from Pokemon. I think it's relatively easy to grind. And also, this is one of the few games where you can actually get the Versus Seeker. So you can actually refight trainers, and in a Nuzlocke capacity, you can refight trainers that are safe, and you can get a decent amount of experience. And also money that you can, you know, use to buy some of those important resources that we talked about. Just like, I think something like that is also just a great feature of these games, that, you know, the worst part of a Nuzlocke is like, you know, grinding and preparing for like your next battles. Like, these games aren't that tedious. That's another aspect of why I think it's just, you know, a great game to play for a Nuzlocke.
Right, I think we of course run the risk, I guess, of sounding like Gen 1ers or whatever you want to call it in how we talk about this game, because
You're goddamn
yeah,
right.
like Kanto has been done a lot. there's a bit of overexposure, but when you look at it as its own package, this is very subjective, but I think it is just so well put together. And like, plenty of people will disagree with us, like Eric is one of them who disagrees with us on this. Like, it's a very subjective thing, but for us, and something that keeps us coming back, is just Kanto. It's such a well put together region, and it's just the progression, the feeling of progression through it feels so fluid to me. Sometimes when I'm playing other Pokemon games, maybe I feel a little bit annoyed that I have to do something before I can progress here, or I have to do that. But like when I get to Silph Co, it's not like I think, oh god, I gotta do Silph Co to do everything else. It's like, okay, it's time to do Silph Co and I know what I want to do. Like, I've decided to do it at this point. So I think that that's just, I love Kanto.
Ain't nothing wrong with that.
There's nothing wrong with that.
I think the other point we want to bring up, and this is, this is even more subjective, I think, compared to even just the design, but I think Fire and Leaf Green are just good looking games. People might have their preferences in terms of Pokemon design and the use of 2D sprites versus 3D models. Personally, I prefer the 2D games. I prefer the 2D sprite work, and I think Fire and Leaf Green has some of the best sprite work in the franchise. I think almost all of the Pokemon look great. I think almost all of their sprites just do a very good job of representing them, and
in a way, like, it almost feels to me like, and this is, again, art is such a subjective thing, and how much of this is coming from nostalgia and how much of this is just personal preference is hard to say, but to me, like, the Gen 3 sprites feel, especially for Gen 1 Pokemon, for Kanto Pokemon, like, Fire Red and Leaf Green sprites are still just the definitive look of all of those Pokemon for me. Like, this is, when you think of like Ditto, when you think of like Raticate, when you think of Magmar, like, to me, I'm thinking of the Gen 3 sprite, and like, it just feels like we reached a pinnacle there that even when you get to like Gen 5, where like, you could easily say Gen 5 is like the peak of sprite work because it's absolutely incredible. The way that the Gen 1 Pokemon look in Gen 5 just doesn't call to me, and it doesn't make me feel as much like I'm looking at like just the definitive representation of the Pokemon as I get the feeling when I look at Fire Red and Leaf Green's Butterfree, when I look at Fire Red and Leaf Green's like Arcanine, And of course, so much of that comes from the fact that I played this as a child and I have the nostalgia for it, but at the same time, it is so good, and it just really encapsulates the region in this very consolidated identity that just, because it is only the Kanto Pokemon, is something that can really just, for the core game being only Kanto Pokemon, it's something that doesn't always happen in the other games where you're encountering Pokemon from multiple regions. There's this sense of artistic cohesion, and I just think it's really good. So yeah, like, of course this is very subjective, but for us, for the two of us playing through these games, I feel like we both feel, every time we launch up this game and just, you hear the music and you hear like the Pokemon's calls in this game and all of just the sound fonts that they use, the textures, the Pokemon's sprite art, it just all comes together into a very satisfying, very like comfortable, it's very comfy, the experience that I have playing these games. And I think that, this is necessarily, maybe this is just, it has to be this way for us because this is one of our earliest games, but that doesn't happen to me. Even games like Diamond, where I spent like every morning on my bus ride to school playing that game and just like having this incredible amount of nostalgia for it, it just doesn't hit me the same way that Fire Red and Leaf Greens does. And I think maybe it's because of just how consolidated and how direct that experience was, and how the game itself, through its presentation, is kind of creating its own nostalgia because it's remaking the origin of this entire series. And I think that on its own just creates this really, really nice sense of comfort and nostalgia it's really hard to replicate that in other games. I think that's something that Fire Red and Leaf Green has that for me doesn't really exist in the other games, and I'm really happy that we have that type of experience with these.
I think my final point on presentation aspect of these games, I think, and, this is subjective, and I'm sorry if there are people who like these games that I'm going to talk about, but I'm just going to be honest. Comparing Fire and Leaf Green to the latest remakes of Diamond and Pearl, those games have a very controversial art style, I'll say. Some people like it, a lot of people seem to dislike it. It seemed like they were going for this homage to, the original Gen 4 look of, we're gonna, we want these games to feel like those games, so we're gonna recreate the art style, try to bank it on that nostalgia. But I think to me, for me, it didn't work, and I don't think those games look all that particularly great, even though I do think the original Gen 4 games look good. And I think, that's a bad mentality for designing, a game in terms of just like its visual presentation, where I think, while the remakes on the Switch, they had much more capability and potential to like create, with the hardware capability to create a different looking, a better looking game than the original games they were remaking, but they chose not to do that for whatever reason. Whereas I think like Fire and Leaf Green, these games were designed to be on the Game Boy Advance. They were designed with all of those hardware limitations in mind, and they still created, in my view, I think, what are like timeless designs. I agree with Andrew when, I think of Kanto Pokemon, I think of the Gen 3 designs. I think they're just so well represented in these games. They were able to create just great looking and great feeling game in terms of just like the visual and audio presentation. I think these games will still, hold up years from now, and I don't think the same can be said for even some of the other Pokemon remakes. So I think that says a lot about the quality of these games.
I would largely agree, and I think that an interesting point that you make is just, for me, and this is personal, like this is just a subjective view that I have, but with things like Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl and some of the modern remakes, that idea is that they're almost reaching backward to something, right? They're reaching backward to try to pull that forward in time, that old style, that classic Diamond and Pearl artwork, that nostalgia. They're trying to pull it forward. But the thing about Fire Red and Leaf Green when they made it is they weren't pulling something backward, they were reaching upward, right? Like they were going up to as much as they could handle with the Game Boy. And almost it feels like, and this, who knows if this is what they viewed it as, but for me it's like almost like they were using the new technology that they had to finally realize the vision of the games they were remaking. They were taking these games and giving them a visual identity that couldn't be achieved when they were made, but that obviously they wanted to achieve. I don't think that can be said so much with modern remakes, and I think that is something that Fire Red and Leaf Green had, the only thing that outdid them on this was Heart Gold and Soul Silver, where I think they did that again. They reached upward and they tried to make something that was true to the original vision, even more so than it could have been at that time. And I think that that's just something that was really special about these remakes at that time. And it's something that maybe personally I don't think we're seeing as much anymore. And like even if we're to compare it to something like Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, which I think has a great style. I think Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee look really good. It's just different in that they're trying to go for something distinct and unique rather than just trying to kind of maximize the identity of the region. But to talk more about Fire Red and Leaf Green, they just felt like they were doing everything they could to make as perfect of a representation of the Kanto region as they could, and I think they did a really good job.
So, after all that, I think it's clear that Andrew and I really like Fire Red and Leaf Green. And we have a lot to say about these games. I'm sure we could talk even longer about the reasons, why we love these games, not only as a Nuzlocke experience, but just as Pokemon games. And to wrap things up, I just want to say that I felt that it was important for us to make this video. I think we needed to openly discuss and talk about, why we love these games so much, because we like the games, amongst our friend group. It's, people are like, God, like, you guys still play Fire League, like, you guys like this game still after playing it so much. And for our content, like, we're obviously focusing a lot on Fire and Leaf Green, and we're going to continue to come back to these games. And, some people might be confused or might reasonably ask, like, why do you continue to play these games when there's a lot of good mainline Pokemon games for Nuzlocking? I just felt like we needed to talk about this because, we have a lot of history with this game, and, after playing our first Nuzlocke, we almost like reevaluated like why we like these games, but in a new light as well, of just mechanics and design. It gave us even more of a reason to like these games. So, I think, like Andrew said in the beginning, for a Nuzlocke, for a lot of people, they choose a game like Fire and Leaf Green as their first Nuzlocke because it's relatively easy and simple, and they can use it to get a feel for the gameplay of a Nuzlocke, and then they'll most likely move on to other games that have more complexity or variety or even, Pokemon that they like. But I think that these games I think people like these games, and I think they're, well regarded. Even in like the Nuzlocke community, I think people see the merits of these games, but I don't think there's a lot of people who would go out and say that they love these games, that they're their favorite games, or they think they're the best for a Nuzlocke. But we felt that they are, and we wanted to talk about that and sort of present our case for these games as why we think they're as good as they are.
So what Mike is saying is that this video has been the longest justification as to why we're just gonna keep playing Fire Red and Leaf Green.
Yeah, like, guess what, guys? It's gonna keep coming.
Honey, it's time for another playthrough of Fire Red and Leaf Green.
Yes, dear.
But jokes aside, oh my god, if you've watched this whole thing, thank you, you're such an angel. Because yeah, we can talk about Fire Red and Leaf Green a lot, and we will do this again in some different context. We're gonna be talking about this game a lot, and now that we've justified it to ourselves, here we go. Because these games are very, very special to us, and we like them a lot, and we want to make content for them. So, this has been a bit of a strange video. I know this isn't really, even with the few that we've put out, this is definitely not totally on brand, but like Mike said, it's important to us to kind of go over what these games are for us and why they're going to be such a major player for us, especially at the starting period of us making content, making videos for YouTube, and playing games. Like, we want to start with something that we love a lot and that we think we can kind of share those feelings with other people. So thank you very much. If you've listened to all of that, that's great. That's so cool. And I hope you enjoy Fire Red and Leaf Green, even close to as much as we do. So from here, like, if you do like the games and if you do kind of like what we've talked about and are interested in seeing the types of runs we're going to put out, we have a couple videos out already. We're going to be doing more challenge runs. We're going to be doing more Nuzlocks, different types of things, tier lists on what we think about these games. We're not necessarily experts, but we have a lot of opinions and we will make those known. So please stick around for some of that. You can subscribe to us if you want to see that. We would really appreciate any support you could give us as we kind of start this all out. So thank you very much and stay phenomenal.